Right, everybody. Well, first of all, I can't but thank so many of you on the eve of your examinations, which were obviously not particularly inviting moments in the academic year for you, for turning out to listen to this, to come along to this seminar, which is the fourth and final seminar in my History of the Present series. Since 2020, I've been striving to make history contemporary, and we've been having every year 2 or 3 people coming and talking about vital questions in which history can speak to present day problems. I'm also delighted as well to say that this particular seminar is also being presented under the auspices as well of the Stephen Muller Chair. I'm very pleased to announce that we have the new Stephen Muller Professor, Mr. Professor Mayer, who is here present. So I think we've already him in the front. I'm sure he's going to be doing all kinds of very interesting things on Germany in the coming year. The topic today is Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust. And our speaker tonight is Andrew Port, who was educated at Yale and Harvard. He's now Professor of History at Wayne State University. And I congratulated him on his being editor of the flagship journal, Central European History, and he told me that that was an enormous task, which he prefers almost to forget, but nevertheless. This book is his most recent book, although he has another one about to come out. Never Again, Germans and Genocide After the Holocaust, published by Harvard University Press, the Belknap edition of the Harvard University Press. And it looks at German reactions to genocide in other parts of the world after 1945, focusing particularly on Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda. And of course, we can also, well, perhaps we're going to update that today in talk. The book was one of 5 books shortlisted for the Laura Shannon Prize, 2025 Laura Shannon Prize, which is given by the Nanovic Institute of Notre Dame University. And official disclaimer, I was actually one of the judges for that prize. I thought it deserved to win, taking nothing away from the one that actually did win, but it was actually my choice as a winner. I forgive you. Yeah. Andrew is also the author of Conflict and Stability in the German Democratic Republic, and he was the recipient of the Dard Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in German and European Studies. Andrew, welcome to SAIS. I'm really looking forward to the talk. I'm sure the audience is as well. Okay, let's go. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, it's a very good number. Okay. It's tough for me to reach. I broke my shoulder last September and I'm still working on getting movement again. Mark, thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate this. I appreciate your kind words about Never Again. We found out before, I didn't put 2 and 2 together, but I have been assigning Mark's textbook on post-war history, world history, for the last, I guess, about 15 years. And so that's, yeah, small world. And I also have a Stephen Muller anecdote, but I can tell you that.
Over dinner?
If you come to dinner, you'll hear the anecdote, yeah. Let me get started. This is kind of a hybrid talk. The first half will be about the book, give you a sense of the book. The second half, I'm going to talk, it's more reflections on the responses to the book since it appeared. All right, I'm an old man now, I have to change glasses. Okay. Well, let me begin by stating the obvious. There are few countries more haunted by the darker aspects of their recent history than Germany. 80 years after the end of World War II, the barbaric crimes committed by the Nazis continue to cast a long shadow at home and abroad, coloring perceptions and self-perceptions of the country and its people. Yet the story of how Germans managed to put their violent genocidal past behind them in practice and create a stable and prosperous democracy, reluctant to use force and committed to the defense of human rights, that's an equally important, I think, gripping tale. If the driving question about the years prior to 1945 has long been a disheartening one, where did Germany go wrong? The period since the war presents, I think, a different puzzle. How and why did Germany go right? I mean, politically. My book, Never Again, it tackles these questions in a roundabout way, using German responses to genocide in other lands to understand how the weight of the past shaped beliefs and influenced actual behavior in the post-war present. I can think of few foreign policy issues more vital than the international community's response or lack thereof to state-sponsored mass murder, despite, since 1945, the oft-repeated injunction, never again. German reactions to genocide are important in this context, I think, because they provide us with a better understanding of how and why powerful states have decided whether to intervene in humanitarian trouble spots across the globe. And given Germany's own intimate relationship with the so-called crime of crimes, its responses to genocide in foreign lands are, I think, especially intriguing. Just as important, they vividly demonstrate how domestic debates and political interests influence such decisions. Cognitive factors were especially important here: values and beliefs, culture, morals, and emotions, all of which are heavily shaped by historical experience and the perceived lessons of the past. And that was especially true for post-war Germany, where an especially intense culture of remembrance about the Third Reich had been cultivated in its western half since the 1960s, and about the Holocaust since the 1970s. In any event, I consciously chose this indirect approach, German reactions to foreign genocide, because I wanted to present a less stilted picture of German memory work. Now, there are many abstract theories about the nature and significance of collective memory, but to my mind, its true importance lies in its consequences, in its tangible effects on actual attitudes and actions. And that's why I focus in my book less on solemn statements by high-level officials, which is the usual approach to German Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, and more on the concrete acts that came in response to reports of foreign genocide decades after the final solution. To get at these issues, and as Mark mentioned, I specifically look at German responses to the three infamous genocides that took place in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Rwanda from the mid-1970s to the mid-1990s. That choice is important because it lays bare evolving reactions to mass murder during a period of drastic change, from the height of the Cold War, when two German states still existed, to the period following unification. From a time when few Germans showed much interest in the Holocaust, to one when three topics generated as much public interest as the genocide of the European Jews. Now, the precise timing of these three genocides is also significant. Why? By chance, a conspicuous spike in interest about the fate of the European Jews coincided with the genocide in Cambodia. In fact, the Khmer Rouge were driven from power the very month the American miniseries Holocaust aired on West German television in January 1979. That sensational media event, estimates are that at least half of all adult Germans watched at least one episode. That sensational media event initiated a public fixation on the final solution. At precisely the point in time when firsthand details about the carnage in Cambodia began to emerge, and it fundamentally influenced German responses to the crimes of the Khmer Rouge. In turn, it affected how Germans spoke and thought about their own past. And that became especially clear in the mid-1980s during the infamous historians' quarrel or Historikerstreit, a fierce public debate between German progressives and conservatives about the uniqueness and causes of what now increasingly became known as the Holocaust. Now, there are other good reasons why I began in the 1970s. It was the decade when global interest in human rights reemerged. It was also when the worldwide flow of refugees reached unprecedented proportions, a development that had a major impact on German responses to foreign genocide. It stimulated humanitarian efforts to relieve mass suffering abroad, but it also stoked fears about letting in, quote unquote, too many foreigners, especially bogus ones, supposedly coming to Germany for purely venal reasons. Now, few issues have enlivened and politicized public debate of late as much as immigration, and of course, not just in the Federal Republic, as we in the US, and I know you here in Italy as well, are well aware. So my book essentially draws attention to two contradictory impulses since the 1970s. Rampant fear, anger, resentment about overburdening, and something the Germans call Überfremdung, or excessive foreignization on the one hand, and on the other, a widespread desire, even compulsion for some because of Germany's past, to help the less fortunate. A look at German reactions to genocide during the first half of the 1990s. It takes our story into the period after the Cold War, and thus into a much different geopolitical context. Germany's unexpected unification in 1990 had not only marked the end of 4 decades of division, but it also transformed the country's international position. The restoration of full sovereignty meant that the country now had greater freedom for maneuver, as well as greater international responsibilities. And its responses to the twin genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda show how this dramatically reconfigured the country's foreign policy, as well as its relationship with a now more distant past. Now, the Federal Republic's changed standing in the world also gave rise to a great deal of anguish and hand-wringing at the time. Would unified Germany remain a quote-unquote tamed power, or would it revert to its dangerous and destructive ways of yore? In other words, had the country truly learned the lessons of its history? Now, the question of what those lessons even were became a great source of vexed debate in the shadow of genocidal atrocities in the Balkans, where unified Germany faced its most significant challenge abroad since unification, whether to participate in joint military efforts aimed at stopping genocide and other human rights abuses on foreign soil. That confronted Germans with difficult choices that threw into disarray the old post-war consensus on foreign policy and the non-use of force. Even renowned pacifists like Joschka Fischer of the Greens, a former student radical who was beating up policemen in the early 70s and later became a Armani-wearing foreign minister of Germany. Even Joschka Fischer came down on the side of humanitarian intervention. I have another interesting anecdote about Joschka Fischer, but this is
Call him a pacifist is strong.
Yeah.
He throws stones. It's very aggressive. It's 70s Frankfurt days.
Yeah, that was Well, that was interesting. When he got into this debate about Bosnia, he said that we've never been pacifists. Those of us who are calling for violence in Central America. My initial interest in German responses to foreign genocide, it came in the summer of 1992 when I first heard reports that Serbs had set up quote unquote concentration camps in Bosnia. I was living in Germany at the time, and I vividly recall television images of emaciated men with shaved heads standing behind barbed wire, and the images resonated for obvious reasons. And I distinctly recall thinking at the time that this could not be true, that there could not be concentration camps in Europe in 1992. And I also recall a great deal of skepticism in Germany as well, as policymakers and public figures in the media struggled to come up with a quote unquote proper response. Never again Auschwitz, or never again war. Those two slogans encapsulated the harrowing dilemma that many Germans, including Fischer, faced after learning about the genocidal atrocities taking place in Bosnia. Should their country, because of its past, stand by and do nothing in response to reports of yet another genocide, this time only a day's drive from Berlin, or should they participate in international interventions intended to stop the mass slaughter by force? The story of how Germans confronted their past and the very concrete consequences that that had in response to mass atrocities abroad, it's a highly relevant story, I think, that is arguably as worthy of our interest as the darker topics in modern German history. And please don't misunderstand me. The focus on Nazism and the Holocaust is, of course, understandable. But the attention my book devotes to the admirable and I think often uplifting actions of Germans from all walks of life, I think it offers other countries with difficult pasts, including my own, the United States, a masterclass in coming to terms with the more sinister aspects of their own history, especially at a moment in time when many seem to fear that the United States might go the way Germany did in the 1930s. Now, looking to the Germans for inspiration reinforces a widespread tendency to see Western Germany as a success story. Now, there are good reasons for questioning that simple but uplifting narrative, which downplays the less sanguine aspects of Germany's post-war history. I'm thinking of endemic racism and sexism, for example, wealth disparities and environmental degradation. Still, even with those caveats in mind, and even when not measured against the horrible foil of Nazi Germany, the Federal Republic was indeed a success story, a place where Germans effectively put their violent, once genocidal past behind them. And their responses to genocide in foreign lands are an untold aspect of that story. Now, it is true that most responses, that their responses didn't do much to prevent genocide. They were more reactive than active, even when it was taking place in their own backyard in the Balkans. And despite the Federal Republic's obligations as an early signatory of the 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. But my book, it doesn't take a normative or prescriptive approach. It's not a j'accuse of Germans for what they should have done in the face of genocide. As many of you probably know, that's the thrust of Samantha Power's 2002 book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, with respect to the Americans, of course. My book explores instead the parameters of the possible for post-war Germany, given the weight of the past and given its own international position before and after 1989. Hardly anyone, least of all the Germans themselves, would have wished or expected East or West Germany to take military action abroad. Now, that would change dramatically after unification. And that transformation, along with the stormy domestic debates unleashed by the decision to intervene militarily in Bosnia, those are central themes of my book, ones that I dare say have great relevance for Germany's evolving position since 2022 on the conflict of the war in Ukraine. That no one expected Germans to take military action abroad. It's an important point because it moves the conversation beyond moralistic condemnations of an action, beyond the writing of history as what I like to call politics by other means. For most countries, grand actions involving military force are extremely difficult or simply not possible. And that's why I focus instead on what German officials and citizens could and did do short of sending combat troops, providing various forms of humanitarian assistance, for example, welcoming large numbers of refugees to Germany, exerting diplomatic pressure behind the scenes, and enforcing economic sanctions. In short, reports of mass atrocities goaded Germans into action. And what they did went far beyond high-sounding speeches meant to somehow atone for past atrocities. That's significant because it reveals a great deal about German values, mentalities, and quote unquote lessons learned after 1945. Again, lessons that should be of interest to Americans searching for effective ways to reckon with the more sordid aspects of their own past. What struck me repeatedly when I was doing the research for the book, what struck me repeatedly about German reactions to foreign genocide is that the legacy and lessons of the Holocaust and the Third Reich were not at all clear-cut. The difficult choice between never again Auschwitz or never again war, it captures just how ambivalent the burden of history could be. In fact, as my book shows again and again, Germany's violent past could be and was used to draw diametrically opposed conclusions about the quote unquote proper response to reports of foreign genocide. Those who tended to see Germany's hands tied because of its history, who spoke passionately of a quote duty to nonviolence because of Nazi atrocities, they met with equally heartfelt counter-arguments by those who pointed to the country's past as an injunction to act. This is a quote. This is something that Klaus Kinkel, the foreign minister at the time, told his colleagues in June 1995, just 2 weeks before the genocidal massacre in Srebrenica. The quote is, "We have a political and moral duty to assist precisely in light of our history. It was, after all, the Allies who, using military force, by the way, freed us from the Nazi dictatorship." And well, if the Third Reich has taught us anything, it's perhaps that there are no easy answers to these questions and debates. But my book draws attention to something that I think is just as important. The mass suffering caused by Germans was not necessarily the past that mattered most. The suffering that Germans experienced themselves during and after World War II, their profound sense of victimhood, not least as refugees, could be equally motivational. And so could perceptions of political and even economic self-interest. In fact, my book shows how these debates about proper responses to genocide were used over and over to score points against domestic political rivals, with progressives accusing conservatives of supporting humanitarian military intervention in hopes of one day restoring Germany's status as a great power. And those on the right responded in kind, asking why the left had remained so silent as Cambodian communists butchered millions. What those debates also show is that most conservatives confronted and took responsibility for Germany's past as seriously as their opponents on the left. And that's an important and often overlooked legacy of the progressive political upheavals of the late 1960s, when Nazi crimes became, for almost all Germans, regardless of political outlook, the measure of all things evil. Now, the willingness of even conservative Germans to countenance their country's difficult past and draw important lessons from it distinguishes them from many of their counterparts in the United States. I'm not going to talk about Italy because I don't know the situation well enough, but it distinguishes them from many of their counterparts in the United States who seem disinclined to confront, much less take responsibility for the history and legacy of American racism, but should also serve as a sign of encouragement that such efforts need not be politically exclusive or one-sided, and nor should remorse. There's perhaps another lesson here for an American audience in particular, what to avoid when confronting the past. After 2 decades of deafening silence about the Holocaust, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction, beginning in the late 1960s, really in the late 1970s, producing an almost obsessive public preoccupation with the dark side of Germany's past that eventually produced an angry backlash, even on the part of those who can in no way be considered apologists for the Third Reich. I'm referring to Germans, even on the left, who complain that the political and moralistic use of negative memories about the Nazi past has been used as a high-handed moral cudgel against political enemies. My book shows how those very disputes dominated public discussion about these genocides in other lands fueling accusations that foreign genocides and foreign atrocities were somehow being used to relativize Germany's own earlier crimes. And this played out in the very language that was used. Heated debates about the appropriateness of referring to Serb prison compounds in Bosnia as concentration camps. That was just one example of this, one that had eerie reverberations in recent debates in the United States about the use of that same charged term, concentration camps, to describe holding facilities for immigrants on the US southern border. The point is that Americans can indeed learn from the Germans about confronting their own checkered past. Some of you might be familiar with Susan Neiman's book, Learning from the Germans. I'll return to that in a few minutes. So Americans and others can learn from Germans about confronting their own past, but those lessons are ambivalent. Again, the backlash in Germany against too much memory has largely been a defiant response to style and approach, to excessive moralizing and finger pointing, to the instrumental use of memory to attack one's foes across the aisle. The need to achieve a balance between too little and too much, to strike a proper tone that doesn't give rise to nasty recriminations and indignant backlash. That is perhaps the most important lesson the Germans can offer us. Since the spring of 2023, when the book came out, I've been on an extended book tour to promote Never Again. This is the highlight.
Thank you.
Invariably, at least one audience member has asked me about German responses to Israel's alleged genocide against the Palestinians. And that was true. Oh, that brought you back. Huh?
Yeah, I really have to go, but I won't.
I'll try to go through it. That was true before the Israeli military response to the Hamas attack of October 7th, but the question now arises even more frequently with greater urgency and emotion, more an accusation than a question. For all of their talk of never again, some audience members want to know, why are Germans not coming out more forcefully on this issue by condemning Israeli actions in Gaza and the West Bank? It's genocide. That criticism jives with increasing criticism more generally of Germany's vaunted Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. If there was one thing historians and other observers of post-war Germany could all agree on until recently, it was that the country's efforts at coming to the terms with the past was a success story worth emulating. Just 6 years ago, Susan Neiman, the American-born director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, she informed us in a much noticed book, Learning from the Germans, that her native countrymen and women could and should take a page from the Germans when it comes to memory work, especially when confronting their own country's fraught legacy of racism, slavery, and Jim Crow. She since backtracked, claiming last year or 2 years ago in the pages of the New York Review of Books that German Vergangenheitsbewältigung has, quote, gone haywire. What happened? Well, in a nutshell, reports after October 7th of a German crackdown on demonstrations at home in support of Palestinians is what happened. But that's not entirely accurate. Chiming in with other academics and public intellectuals, Neiman's change of tune didn't appear suddenly or out of nowhere. She'd already distanced herself from her earlier arguments prior to recent events in the Middle East, largely in the wake of a controversy initiated by A. Dirk Moses in 2021. In a polemical online essay, the Australian-born historian posited a dark side to German memory culture, namely a distinct reading of the Holocaust that not only immures German elites to the suffering of other groups, in particular Palestinians, he claims, but even makes them antipathetic toward those groups. There's a prehistory to that debate unleashed by Moses. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with that discussion? No. If anybody wants to send me an email, I'm happy to send you links to all of it because it really is quite interesting and it's all available online. At any rate, as I said, there's a prehistory to all this that's been brewing for roughly the past decade. To wit, a questioning of the old narratives of successful German memory work. And that debate, ironically, burst onto the public scene around the same time that Neiman's Learning from the Germans appeared in 2019. And in his now, I'd say, infamous piece, which he titled The German Catechism, Moses identified three main catalysts for this revirement. The heated German debate about Achille Mbembe's alleged anti-Semitism. Mbembe, Cameroonian scholar who supported the BDS movement. Michael Rothberg's book, Multidirectional Memory. And last but not least, Jürgen Simmer's From Windhoek to Auschwitz, which posits lines of continuity between German colonial practices and the Holocaust. So what should we make of these recent claims that we've been too quick to praise the Germans for their culture of remembrance? The naysayer's case, which one might dub the post-colonial catechism or the post-colonial mantra, you pick. And I say this with apologies to serious practitioners of post-colonial studies. The post-colonial mantra consists of 6 main arguments, and I want to quickly outline them for you. One, these are not my arguments, right? I'm summarizing what Moses and others have argued, and German authorities have imposed from on high an official state policy that dictates proper ways to remember Germany's past. As a result, the country's once admirable efforts at Vergangenheitsbewältigung have assumed a static quality limited solely to the genocide of the Jews. And to add insult to injury, it ignores earlier German colonial atrocities and also current ones worldwide. 2, at the same time, Germany's sense of responsibility for the Nazi past has produced a cloying philo-Semitism that finds its clearest expression in quote-unquote unconditional solidarity in Israel. This in turn has led to 3 serious violations of civil liberties and free speech. Cancel culture run amok, litmus tests for state funding and citizenship, the banning of symbols and slogans deemed anti-Semitic, all in an effort supposedly to silence critics of Israel, including Jewish ones. Point 4, by preventing Germans from thinking clearly about the current political situation, memories of past shame are also being instrumentalized to, quote unquote, suppress debate about disturbing developments abroad, especially in the Middle East. But that's not all, and this is point 5. By automatically disqualifying reasonable and justified criticism of Israeli policies as anti-Semitic, German watchdogs are stoking xenophobic sentiment and using it as a weapon against undesirable immigrants who they claim harbor such distasteful views. As a result, and this is the 6th and final point, Germany's vaunted efforts to deal with its ignoble past have, quote, backfired, gone haywire, produced a form of hysteria, leading to the oppression and demonization of other traditionally persecuted minorities. Dirk Moses recently published a piece online in which he cited that. He went on to attack me, but it's actually almost word for word what I wrote to you just now. I'm talking about, okay, I'm not going to use the P word. Yeah. These arguments and criticisms that I just outlined, they cannot and should not be dismissed out of hand, but they are also distorted, exaggerated, and unduly polemical. Only ignore important context. With respect to the last point, context, those who have identified a recent turn for the worse in Germany's culture of remembrance have not made any real attempt to explain the roots of this supposedly sudden transformation, apart from vague allusions to growing concerns about immigration and asylum requests by the quote-unquote wrong sort of foreigners from places like Afghanistan and Syria, Israel's longtime foe. What they leave out is the elephant in the room, namely the statistically verifiable uptick in anti-Semitic incidents in Germany over the past few years, from the violent Yom Kippur attack at a synagogue in Halle in former East Germany in 2019, to online conspiracy claims that COVID was a Jewish plot, Jew flu, Holocaust. It's frequently pointed out that the vast majority of such incidents are committed by white ethnic Germans on the extreme right of the political spectrum. But as investigative journalists like Steinke and others have shown, certain groups of non-ethnic Germans are disproportionately represented, especially Muslims. This, I think, is an important context for understanding the recent hysteria, for understanding, say, a controversial resolution adopted in 2019 by the German parliament, the Bundestag, which A, condemned, to my mind mistakenly, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, the BDS campaign against Israel, as anti-Semitic, and B, called for cutting off funding to any organizations that, quote, actively support the BDS movement. But the post-colonial mantra, it misleads, I think, in a different way as well. German responses to genocide in other lands, the subject of my recent book, it provides a clear example of how memories of the Nazi period were used by Germans in support of other persecuted groups, not to deny them succor or sympathy. And that is incidentally a clear instance of Rothberg's multi-directional memory and practice, for those of you familiar with this book. Now, German efforts at Vergangenheitsverwältigung have not always been perfect. It may have been, as Nyman claims, quote, too little, too late. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. German memory work remains one area where the Federal Republic can rightly claim to be a success story, especially as it begins to grapple in earnest with its colonial past, in contradistinction, say, to most of its allies in the rest of Europe and, of course, across the Atlantic. The point is not to deny that some Germans have made accusations of anti-Semitism in an instrumental way, in a sense, just as the Trump administration is currently doing, namely to stoke xenophobia and advance an anti-immigrant agenda. Nor am I trying to justify or excuse official excesses in response to perceived anti-Semitic agitation and calls for violence. But because of their past, Germans are once again finding themselves in a difficult position of being damned if they do and damned if they don't. One can only imagine the reaction from abroad at home in Germany if German authorities were to look on passively as critics of Israel pass out celebratory baked goods in central Berlin, as happened, in response to the murderous rampage of October 7th, or call implicitly or explicitly for the destruction of Israel. In the end, as historian and sociologist Günther Jelinek has observed, the quote, accusation of anti-Semitism becomes the problem, not the statements that precipitated it. Now, one should not, of course, automatically equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, right? But one should also not deny that there is oftentimes a link. And that tension is well captured in the competing statements on the topic by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, and by signers of the so-called Jerusalem Declaration. To state the often overlooked obvious, one has to judge each incident on a case-by-case basis, not make broad, misleading generalizations about German authorities offering unconditional support to Israel or suppressing civil liberties by canceling all critics of Israel and cracking down on all forms of pro-Palestinian protest. It's ironic, by the way, that those who support the BDS boycott are frequently the same ones who suddenly scream foul when supporters of Israel attempt to silence their opponents. It's also ironic, I think, is that many people have complained about being canceled. They've been referred to now in Germany as the omnipresent canceled. Deborah Feldman is one of them. I don't know if you've seen the Netflix series Orthodox, but She's on TV all the time talking about how she's not allowed to express her views in public. What about German responses to the claim that Israeli policies toward the Palestinians constitute genocide? Many Germans are understandably wary to use that charged term when it comes to the Middle East because of their own history. And for the same reason, German officials have kept a tight rein on pro-Palestinian demonstrations at home, even those involving Jewish critics of Israel. And the latter, Jewish critics in particular, have indignantly asked what right Germans have lecturing Jews about the appropriateness of such allegations and language. Well, at the same time, one can only imagine what the reaction would be if German authorities were to join the growing chorus of those who accuse Israel of genocide in Gaza and elsewhere. But don't Germans have a duty to call a duck, so to speak, even more so because of their past? Recall Foreign Minister Kinkel's 1995 comments about a, quote, political and moral duty to assist precisely in light of our history. Such considerations once again place Germans in a difficult position. One can, in theory, and with an eye to international law and the provisions of the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, one can have an open, sober, and rational discussion about whether Israeli actions against the Palestinians constitute genocide, which the convention defines as a series of specific, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. But there's a difference between legal definitions on the one hand, popular emotional understandings of the term on the other. There's been a long tendency, not just in Germany, to equate genocide with Auschwitz. And as a result, those who invoke the term to describe crimes that fall below the threshold of industrialized mass murder are often suspected of somehow whitewashing past German crimes by relativizing the Holocaust. The point, I suppose, is that much of the debate has to do with subtexts, imputed political motives, as well as unspoken yet understandable fears about undesirable consequences that might follow from a broader, seemingly less indiscriminate use of the term genocide, regardless of its strict legal applicability. For similar reasons, and I'd like to conclude with this point, many Germans, and Americans as well, react adversely to other loaded terms like apartheid and ghetto when it comes to characterizing Israeli policies, or to words like boycott and calls for international sanctions against Israel. And again, one can have a rational discussion about the appropriateness and fairness of such terms, but one can also understand why, in the context of centuries of anti-Semitic persecution culminating in the Holocaust, why supporters of Israel and Zionism see loaded terms like these as microaggressions. And at the same time, they wonder, if they don't wonder, they should, they wonder why those who denounce the use of microaggressions against other traditionally persecuted groups seem to have less qualms about them when it comes to Jews, or less understanding for Jews who perceive and denounce them as such. In any event, a popular narrow understanding of what constitutes genocide, industrialized mass murder, it's one reason I think why the injunction never again remains an unfulfilled aspiration. The purported deportation and Russification of Ukrainian children would, for instance, clearly count as a form of genocide according to the terms of the 1948 UN Convention. Does the same hold true for the forced evacuation of Palestinians from Gaza, which critics of Israel deny as ethnic cleansing? Now, that's a question worth serious deliberation, and we should talk about that this evening. It's worth serious deliberation. It's one upon which the International Criminal Court's verdict in the case that South Africa has brought against Israel will ultimately shed light. Until then, both critics and defenders of Israeli policies in Germany and elsewhere, they should avoid inflammatory language, or at least be more circumspect about using loaded terms that needlessly provoke and thus do more to hinder than abet debate and actions that might help innocent people in Gaza and elsewhere. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to take 3 questions at a time, and if anybody online wishes to write questions, please send to me questions, and I would just simply say very briefly, ask a question for your, introduce yourself, and ask a brief question, please, as quickly, reasonably quickly. Okay, Hannah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Hannah. I'm from Germany. I'm about to finish my degree in a week's time. I'm curious about what you said about the uptick in anti-Semitism in Germany recently. My perception is that we've, and I'm speaking about the homemade anti-Semitism here, not the whatever it's really called. So native far right Germans, you know, who do these crimes. And I'm wondering, is that really a recent development, or is that something that's been there the entire time, and we just maybe it just hasn't come to the foreground as much? And I think it's that NSU of the early 2000s not the best example, that it was literally there in the underground the whole time, and it's just maybe people feel more empowered not to come out of that.
Okay, there was a gentleman in the white shirt over. Just give us your name as well.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Jurek. I'm also German. I actually wrote my bachelor thesis on memory politics in Germany, so I thought it was a very interesting, very balanced talk. Thank you for that. My question is on the difference between East and West. And you were mentioning West Germany a lot, but there's a very different memory culture between East and West, education system entrenched. The GDR having, well, yeah, freed everyone who is German from the crimes of the Nazi Reich, because it was not a continuation. And that obviously made something very differently out of East Germans and West Germans, who didn't feel like they had to deal with genocide the same way that West Germans had, where there was continuation. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about West Germans versus East Germans, how education shaped it, and how the socialization of those systems.
One more question, and then we'll have another round.
Thank you very much. My name is Antonio. I'm also German. I'm also second nationality, so I'll break that. Sorry, but my question is on what you're was talking about, differences between different generations of groups in Germany. Is there a generational divide as well? Thank you very much.
In response to
In general, yeah, well, especially on Gaza.
Gaza.
Okay, if you want to respond to those 3, and then I shall take others, just send a wave a hand if you've got a further question.
Okay. Anna?
Yeah.
You asked about the optic in this anti-Semitism, something new. Statistics show that there has been an uptick in recent years. Of course, anti-Semitism didn't disappear entirely after 1945, and it fluctuates. And you can look at the various surveys, and 20% of Germans still harbor some sort of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic views. What I find interesting is, and this has come up a number of times in when my book has been discussed or reviewed. I don't know if you know this fellow, Pankaj Mishra, who writes for the, he reviewed the book for the London Review of Books, and he only read the conclusion as far as I can tell, and takes one sentence from it to support his arguments, but completely out of.
That sounds like the reviewing standards of the London Review of Books, but yeah, carry on.
I wasn't going to go there, but yeah. So he quotes, and others do as well, the statistic that 85 or 90% of all anti-Semitic crimes are committed by ethnic Germans, by the extreme right. I'm happy to send you a very interesting article that I recently read about this, which argues that those statistics are actually not true, and they focus very much on the role of anti-Semitic behavior on the part of many of the immigrants. And to be honest, I don't know what the right answer is. This criticism that I read, I found very interesting, and the fellow seemed to have done his research. But I guess what is new now in Germany is this type of anti-Semitism / anti-Zionism that many from the Middle East, for understandable reasons, have brought with them. Europe, East and West German differences. So in the book I write about the responses to Cambodia in particular. And the one major difference that I noticed was that when East Germans talked about genocide, the genocide in Cambodia, some made allusions to what had happened in Germany, but for them, the really interesting question was, how is it possible that communists could have committed such awful crimes? So I'd say that's one of the major differences. You know, I mentioned Nyman's book before. I'm writing a piece on it right now. She has in her third chapter this kind of outrageous claim that the East Germans did a better job of dealing with the Nazi past than West Germany did. I don't think her arguments hold any water, but that might be of interest to you, how she makes that case. And the last question, Antonio, the generational divide on Gaza, I really can't answer that. I wish I could. My suspicion is that younger people are probably more critical of Israeli policy than older people, but I don't want to say anything with that really. And I just want to add just one other thing. When I was writing the book, you know, as a good social historian, I was also interested in generational issues, and I didn't notice much of a difference there. Generation. I mean, of course, those who had lived through World War II, had been refugees, had a certain take and a certain understanding, but I found it very difficult to categorize people by generation, even by political party. Within political parties, the divisions ran very deep. Bosnia, for example, Social Democrats, Greens, some supported intervention, others didn't.
Okay, let's over here, then Professor Radchenko, and then over here. Back.
Hello, my name's Anne and I'm not German. I'm American. But I kind of wanted to take Antonio's question and flip it to the American context. So generationally, Joe Biden was obviously very pro-Israel. The news talked about that as a generational component. Kamala Harris seemed to be less, at least publicly pro-Israel as she was running her election campaign. Can you talk about it? Can you talk about this never again policy in terms of in a US context, especially as it relates to today's political climate?
Professor Radchenko.
Sergey Radchenko, I suppose I should say I'm a ruthless cosmopolitan. Can I ask two questions?
Sure.
Short ones. The
My
first,
flight is on Wednesday.
the first one is specific about Cambodia, since you raised Cambodia, and I wish we had more discussion of the specific cases that you talk about in your book. You said that the East Germans wondered or asked themselves how the communists could do something like that. Of course, the communists also, quote unquote, rescued Cambodia when Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1979. So how was the East German versus West German reaction in that case? And secondly, a more contemporary question, the discussion of genocide as it pertains to Israel's actions in Gaza in Germany today, how does that compare to the discussion of genocide that you alluded to of Russia carrying out genocide in Ukraine? What are the similarities and differences?
Thanks, Sergey.
Thank you. My name is Annabelle, German again. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. I wanted to ask to what extent you also looked at the fact that it was not only Jews that were victims of the Holocaust, but also people with disabilities, queer people, Sinti and Roma, sometimes even the fact that you would be unemployed could be a reason for you to end up in the concentration camp. And yet we have a very specific communication culture around anti-Semitism and around Jews in Germany, and we don't have the same culture when it comes to other forms of discrimination against various people. So I'm just curious how that plays into all of that.
Okay. And generational divide. Well, I wouldn't say that Kamala Harris was more critical of Israel. I mean, I think that she presented a kind of sane take on it, that we're carefully monitoring the situation, and we don't want to have war crimes and excesses. That wasn't enough, unfortunately, for certain communities in the United States to support her, especially in my own state of Michigan, which probably went red this time, in part at least because of the Muslim community in Dearborn near Detroit. But I don't generational. I really hate making generalizations about that. Are younger people, as a rule, more prone to be critical of Israel? I can tell you my experiences teaching for the last quarter century, that I do notice that students, my older daughter came to one of my seminars this semester, and she could not believe the arguments that the students were making in support of terrorist activities. I had them watch the movie Battle of Algiers, and when I first taught that years ago, this is about the uprising in the FLN uprising in Algeria in the 50s. The students would express a lot of understanding for what the FLN did, and then I would say, okay, well, what about September 11th? Do they also have a legitimate? And no, it's completely different. And what I've noticed more recently, also in that class, that even September 11th, they're seeing as somehow justified. That weaker people, the weapons of the weak are legitimate, when you're facing a superior force. Cambodia, East and West German reactions. That's a very interesting question. The big debate after the Khmer Rouge were overthrown was who would get to represent Cambodia in international organizations like the UN. The West Germans and the United States and China all voted for the Khmer Rouge and their allies, and East Germans, of course, for the new regime. So all of these, so essentially, the types of things you write about, the Soviet, Chinese, that played a very important role in the GDR. Well, so I got to interview the first East German ambassador to Cambodia, a former truck mechanic. You remember? Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, that was quite a long interview. He spoke in this very thick Saxonian accent. I had to listen to the recording 3 or 4 times to get what he said. But it was interesting. He told me a lot about at least the humanitarian aid that they gave. The East Germans delivered directly, again, because of the geopolitical constellation. The East Germans sent aid directly to Cambodia. The West Germans only to Thailand, to the refugee camps there. So Annabelle, I would say this. I would take issue with your point about the Holocaust also including other groups. My understanding of the Holocaust is that refers specifically to the mass, systematic mass murder of the Jews. But of course, you're right. Jews were not the only ones who suffered. And one of the things I noticed when I was writing this book was how not so subtle racism came to the fore, especially against the Cambodians. Things like the Asian smile, deviousness, things like that. The Rwandans live in the jungle, you know, these kinds of awful racist statements that most Germans I know would not ever use, at least in public, about Jews. And one of the things I argue in the book, or I speculate at the end of the book, is that I think the Germans are so rightfully proud of what they've done vis-a-vis, you know, the crimes committed against the Jews, that I think they find it hard to believe, or I think they're less careful about everyday racism towards other groups. And even good leftist progressive Germans I know will make, obviously not all, but will make prejudiced comments in passing that, I mean, I guess it's coming back to the United States. For a while we didn't do that, but now it's become a whole phase again. Yeah, I mean, I don't like this argument that the Germans have, you know, they ignore the suffering of these other groups. You know, I mean, you go to Berlin, you have this monument in Noldorfplatz for homosexuals. I mean, this has changed over the last year. Also, with regard to German colonial history, you know, Moses and Simmer and others, they're fond of beating up on the Germans for not looking to the colonial past. But, you know, again, I'm not an expert in other countries, but my impression is that the Brits certainly haven't done a lot on that score. The Italians, I assume, also.
Italiani, brava gente.
Yeah. So, so I guess I'm a little less critical of the Germans when it comes to that. Did I respond?
Okay, 3 more questions. First was the person over here, and then Professor Hill, and then is that you, Josephina? Right? Okay.
Hi, my name is Dalia and I come from Finland and Lebanon. My question is specifically about the International Criminal Court. Germany has obviously been signatory to the Rome Statute from almost the very beginning and is one of the biggest financial contributors to the Trust Fund for Victims. And they have always expressed very strong support for the work of the ICC. Obviously now with the arrest warrant for Netanyahu, I'm just curious, this is a specific question about Chancellor Merz, which I don't know if he actually got that position or if he's still running. But he has said that he would openly welcome and invite Netanyahu to Germany, and that, you know, it seems like Germany is in this contestation between being a strong supporter for the ICC, but on the other hand, wanting to invite Netanyahu would obviously go against the obligation to arrest him if he were to step on German soil. So just kind of your thoughts on that and what response that might trigger if that were to happen and they were not to arrest Netanyahu.
Thanks, Christopher Hill. I'm a senior associate fellow here and also emeritus at Cambridge. Thank you very much. Just as a very small footnote, I remember Angela Merkel has a rather striking chapter in her autobiography about exactly this, with passionate defense of the official German position. But your historical account made me think of raised two particular questions. One is about the formation of the Genocide Convention, the role of people like Raphael Lemkin and Pact and so on. These were Jewish lawyers, weren't they, basically? And of course, this was the time between 45 and I suppose Eichmann that, you know, Germany wasn't thinking about these things, just as they were trying to keep the flame alive, as it were. So, I mean, do you think that you know, there was a almost sort of deliberate, we don't want to notice this, or it just was, there were too many other things to cope with in that period between 45 and 60. And then it comes up
to their own past.
Yeah, and the second thing is about Cambodia. Again, I mean, unless I got the chronology wrong, this was also about the time that Baader Meinhof was pretty active, saying, you know, our parents have not come to terms with what we did exactly. So just at the time that Germans are becoming more sensitive to what's going on in Cambodia, Baader Meinhof is the other at home, which we can't possibly have anything to do with or listen to their views. shut down. Anyway, is that interesting or not?
Okay, back, Josephine.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Josephine. I'm also German. I have two questions, short ones. A, what is your data? Like, if you could enlighten us as to what data you work with and how you analyzed it. And second, it seems to me like there's this contradiction between, like, you kept talking about the never again Auschwitz or never again war. And it seems to me like there's a kind of contestation between, is remembrance culture something that is specific to the Holocaust and specific to the crimes against Jews? Or is remembrance culture, as Germany has practiced it in this case, something that can be extended to be more generic and include more kind of broader forms of discrimination, both in terms of its own past and ongoing questions? But is that something that you think is conceptually possible?
I'm going to start with your questions. It was the freshest in mind. What do you mean is what conceptually possible to you?
Having grown up in Germany, I think part of the remembrance culture that I have experienced is that we talked about the Holocaust literally every year of high school in like 5 different subjects. In my understanding, that's something that would just not be valuable to do with all, like, kind of, if the same amount of attention was like given to this one subject in the way that it's currently given, seems to be in like not easily compatible with like remembering and acknowledging different forms of discrimination. But it could be embedded in a different kind of, in the broader acknowledgement of discrimination and racism and crimes, but that would then take away perhaps from this kind of unique status that is given to the Holocaust and the crimes against Jews. So is that something that's compatible, expanding it, or would that take away from the very core of making it this kind of giving it this unique position in memory?
Well, I certainly think it's compatible. I also understand the concerns of people who think that if you start paying more attention or as much attention to the suffering of other groups, that will somehow take away from the awfulness of the Holocaust. I get those concerns. I don't think they're necessarily correct. And I would certainly hope for a more inclusive discussion. I mean, what you say, and the first time I went to Germany was in late 1987. That was when I first met Germans. I'd been studying in Paris at the time, met a number of Germans there who never admitted to being Germans. They were always cosmopolitan, they would never say they were actually German. And that was when I first heard about how much attention is given to this in the schools. I had no idea. When I went to Berlin the first time, I got out of Berlin at the Zoll, the train station, and I walked across the street, and the first thing I saw was this giant sign, places of terror we should never forget. And I thought, you know what I'm talking about in Wittenbergplatz in Berlin? And I remember standing there and thinking, I just read about the civil rights movement in the US in college the year before, and I remember thinking, we have nothing like that in the US. My concern, you didn't use this word, but I'll use it, the overkill in terms of teaching about it. My concern was always that there would be a backlash against that. You know, we're sick and tired of hearing about this. That was why I was so surprised when Goldhagen came out with his book in the mid-90s, Hitler's Willing Executioners. So many people, young people embraced that book, which I didn't expect. I thought, you know, after his this controversial thesis about eliminationist anti-Semitism, that people were going to say, you know, like, as to that now, we're sick and tired of hearing about this. And the reaction was just the opposite, which surprised me. Sources. Well, where should I start? I did a lot of oral interviews. I read thousands of newspaper articles. I worked in over a dozen archives. So those are the main sources. Professor Hill. So if I understood your question correctly, the first part of your question was about the Germans really not talking about their past in the first decade or so?
Yes, is that a right characterization, those 15 years, despite that there is a kind of, not a wiping out, but preoccupation with everything else?
Yeah.
And despite the fact that Lemke and others were.
Right. I think it is a fair perception. What happened to the Jews was certainly not front and center until the early to mid 60s. What I would argue, though, is that the Germans, there was a different type of Vergangenheitsbewältigung in East and West Germany, which you saw right away in the late 40s, which was, what can we do to prevent that from ever happening again? But the discussion of German crimes, especially towards the Jews, that does not begin until much later. And there's this common misperception that it begins with the 68 generation. That's also not true. The Meinhof and others certainly referred to, they didn't call it the Holocaust at the time, but referred to it, but to portray themselves as the new Jews. They were the new victims. It's really in the late 70s and the 80s, after this Holocaust miniseries, that it captures this. I start off the book by talking about Lemkin's drive to get the West Germans to sign on or to accede to the convention. They were invited in late 1950, and he got wind of this and wrote to them, wrote to Adenauer and others, and really waged a campaign in American newspapers and German newspapers, trying to get the Germans to sign on, but in a specific way. He had issues with the way in which they were translating parts of the convention to fit their own law. But what I found interesting, was that in the letters that he sent to Adenauer and others, the focus was not on what had happened to the Jews. The focus was on how, by signing the convention, that would help the Germans. Yeah. In terms of getting the prisoners back from the Soviet Union, in terms of the land that was taken away in the East. So strategically, it was very interesting the way he framed that. Talia?
Yeah.
There you are. Don't get old. It's really, the eyes just really go. Okay, the Netanyahu arrest. It's been a while since you asked the question. I might have forgotten.
I can briefly repeat it.
Yeah.
It's just Germany is one of the biggest supporters of the ICC and also financially for the trust fund for victims. Like, how would it play out if they were to invite Netanyahu and then not arrest him?
You know, I understand your question. It's a good question. You know, the Germans are in this really difficult situation, right, because of their past. I think there are probably voices in Germany who think Netanyahu shouldn't be invited. If he were, that he should be arrested. I understand that Matt said that he wouldn't. You could imagine what would happen if he were to come and he were arrested. It's not to say that not doing it is the right or the wrong choice. I just think one has to look at it from the perspective of the Germans and you know, their past history. When I first went to Germany in the late 80s, and I was told, you know, as an American who proud of the First Amendment and freedom of speech, when I was told, not that I was looking to buy this, but when I was told that you couldn't purchase a copy of Mein Kampf in bookstores, I thought, you know, what is that? And I've come over the years, over the decades, I've come to have greater understanding for this difficult situation that the Germans find themselves. That in another situation, they would act in a certain way, but given this awful history, their hands are tied. I just want to add one other thing. You know, it's often said, this argument about the Germans giving unconditional solidarity and support to Israel. It's just not true. I don't have it in my head, but there's a statistic, 2020 or 2022, there were 20 or 30 UN resolutions condemning Israel for human rights abuses. For all of the countries, only 7 or 8, but for Israel, 20 or 30. Germany supported almost all of them. To make the suggestion, if you listen to what Babcock said in terms of what's going on in Gaza, it's not as if it's completely off limits to criticize Germany. And my experiences of the last 35 years, many of the young Germans I hung out with, kind of leftist Germans, I've been hearing criticism of Israel for decades now from Germans. And so when I read by in Moses' work or others that you're not allowed to criticize Israel, it's just not true.
Okay, one last question, Algin. Then I'm going to abuse my position of chair by asking a completely nerdy historian's question, but it can carry.
Hi, my name is Arjun Joshi. I'm from the United States. I was curious about, we've obviously talked about Palestine quite a bit, but I also was curious about how the German government has responded to other human rights crises or genocides that are happening for other Muslim communities. So obviously what's happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar, what's happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And I'm curious how much the German government's relationship to those specific states has impacted the response versus obviously with the case of Palestine, relationship to Israel versus relationship with PRC or the relationship with the military juntas in Myanmar.
Can I ask my nerdy question as well? I'm going to give a bit of a eulogy for this book here because with all due respect to social historians, they're not always the easiest of reads. What I liked about this book, and I really want to underline this point, is the way that you made the social history come to life by referring to actual individuals, such as the East German ambassador would be the former mechanic. And my question is, how important is it for us as historians, first of all, to do what you do in this book, which is integrate political and intellectual history together with social history? And second, remember that we shouldn't take as historians, we shouldn't take too much refuge in abstractions, but we should be concrete. Because this is what strikes me about your book, and it's a eulogy. I know how often do you get eulogies from me, guys? Not often, but you bring out the concrete, the way it meant a lot to individuals. Can't say no to it, but it's true.
No. Let me start with the reaction to other genocides. I try to read as much as I can in the Valley paper. I'm really no expert on that. I assume, from what I've read, it's very similar to how other Western nations respond to condemnation. This is terrible. And I would imagine the Germans are also sending some aid. But they have their geopolitical considerations, like economic ties with China. They have to be very, just like the United States, we have to be very careful. And of course, it's hypocritical, right? You condemn the Russians for what's going on in Ukraine, but so when I was an undergraduate, I only did really straightforward history. Paul Kennedy was one of my teachers, and diplomatic political history, that's all I knew. And then I went to graduate school and learned about social history and the new cultural history and all of these. And it was very difficult for me because I don't think I'm a very abstract thinker, and I'm not really I don't really get excited about theory and jargon, which is, I suppose, a shortcoming on my part, but I like to read. I think, who was it? I quote this in the book, Richard Cobb.
Yeah.
Richard Cobb. Yeah, Richard Cobb was like, so what's your theory? What's your approach? And he said, oh, my approach is I read as much as I can and I try to make sense of it. And I try to do I know Richard Cobb, but I try to do the same thing. And I would like to think that I wear theory or method lightly, in the sense that, of course, I've been exposed to it, and where it helps, I use it. but I'm not committed to, I'm sorry. You asked the other one, sorry, but I'm not committed to one, to one approach or, which I think some people would probably find to be a shortcoming, that it's not more theoretical, the book. But, what I say about memory, for example, there's all, I sat and I waded through hundreds of pages about, Hogfox and, reading about collective memory. And it's interesting, but I thought at the end, what I am interested in is how memory functions in everyday life. How does it affect what people actually do and how they report?
And I think you get a better grasp in some ways than you ever would from the theory, just from the reactions of individual German politicians and ordinary people and activists who simply express what memory meant to them.
Yes. Yeah, and of course the criticism though is, well, isn't that all just anecdotal? I had, my first book was on communist East Germany. It was a grassroots study of conflict and stability in the East German provinces. I spent 2 years in the archives writing down everything that I was typing out, everything that I could. And one of the reasons I did that was because of that concern. Well, okay, you found this example, but how typical of this. Would you find, like what I said before about the East Germans, saying for them the issue was not Germany's past, but how is it possible for communists? When you hear that enough times, I think you can make a generalization that at least the true believers thought that.
I'd just like to thank our speaker very much and thank you all for coming today. Thanks, Chris, for making it totally unfounded.